Chapter 2 For All Mankind. The Commission of Government. Lord Amery and Alexander Clutterbuck were not the only important visitors touring Newfoundland in the summer of 1933. Charles Lindbergh was traveling around the island as well, scouting out the best locations for aerodromes for Pan American World Airways. He would settle on Bottonwood, which became a refueling stop on the Great Circle route 6 years later. Lindbergh also attended an international conference in St. John's involving Pan American, Imperial Airways, and government officials from the United States, Great Britain, Canada, and Newfoundland, where agreement was reached on establishing a transatlantic air route in Newfoundland. As Jim Haley put it, it is impossible to overestimate the importance of aviation in the 20s and 30s. It was equal to the space race and the internet today. The world was being connected faster and faster, and everyone was excited about it. And Newfoundland was at the center of all the activity. After World War I, airfields sprung up around St. John's and in Harbor Grace, and we had a steady stream of famous aviators coming to the island with their entourages. When I was just a boy, my father took me by the hand and pointed up to the sky to see the Lindbergh fly over. When the Graf Zeppelin came across from Europe, it flew down low over St. John's, and we all waved up at the passengers. All the boys had balsa planes with propeller powered by a rubber band. Since 1919, everyone who was trying to cross the Atlantic non-stop came to Newfoundland to take off. The reason was obvious, of course. Newfoundland is 1,000 miles further out in the Atlantic, and therefore 1,000 miles closer to Europe than New York is. So my generation had great expectations for aviation in Newfoundland, and so did Great Britain. By the end of the First World War, Britain realized that the supremacy of its great cruise ship was over. Air travel would replace steamers travel, and if Great Britain wished to retain its superiority, it must somehow take the lead in aviation. In 1919, the English team of John Alcock and Arthur Brown, flying out of Leicester Field in St. John's, was the first to make the transatlantic hop successfully. Their prize of £10,000 or $50,000 was put up by Lord Northcliffe, the owner of Britain's Daily Mail, though it was presented by Winston Churchill, then Secretary of State for Air in Lloyd George government. Britain had its eye on Newfoundland, and once the Commission of Government was in place in St. John's in 1934, it immediately began to construct the largest aerodrome in the world at Gander. According to Haley, everyone knew what Britain was up to and why it wanted Newfoundland. Amery had foreseen a Great Britain rebuilding of Newfoundland, and the Commission of Government announced many lofty development plans. By and large, these plans came to nothing. In fact, unemployment and poverty increased under Britain rule. The Newfoundland airport at Gander, however, was completed and operational by 1938 at a cost of £900,000 or almost $5 million. Despite the Great Depression, and it gave Britain instant superiority in transatlantic civil aviation. The imperial gambit had worked. And as important as Newfoundland was to Great Britain in civil aviation before the Second World War, after 1939, it became absolutely vital to the war effort. When France fell to the Nazis in 1940, Britain, cut off from the rest of Europe, faced blockade and isolation. Overnight, the North American convoy route became Britain's only lifeline. Everything it needed, from flour to bombers, now came from North America, and the western end of that lifeline was the island of Newfoundland, which by a stroke of amazing good fortune was under British government control. By then, both Canada and the United States were abundantly aware of the island's strategic importance to them as well. Any eventual attack on North America from across the Atlantic would first encounter Newfoundland. Once again, the oldest colony, now the newest, proved an invaluable bargaining chip for the United Kingdom, as Newfoundland became the Gibraltar of North America. In 1940, Britain signed the lease base agreement with the United States for the defense of the island, by means of which Britain obtained 50 American destroyers that it badly needed for continuing the war in return for a lease for the U.S. bases in Newfoundland and the Caribbean. The agreement of the bases in Newfoundland, the largest outside the United States, provided that His Majesty's government will secure the grant of the government of the United States freely and without consideration of the lease for immediate establishment and use of naval and air bases and facilities for entrance thereto, and the operation and protection thereof on the Avalon Peninsula and on the southern coast of Newfoundland and on the east coast. All the bases will be leased to the United States for a period of 99 years, free from all rent. The British government's assertion of the right to lease large tracts of Newfoundland territory to foreign powers for close to a century without any reference to the local people raised strong objections across the island and became a cause for further embarrassment to the Commission of Government. Lord Cranborne at the Dominion's office recognized that very real hardship to the inhabitants of the territories in Newfoundland might well be involved. Prime Minister Winston Churchill was worried that Newfoundlanders would consider the extremely harsh American terms, which included total jurisdiction for the United States on its base, as a surrender. He met personally in London with two of the visiting Newfoundland commissioners, L.E. Emerson and J.H. Panson, and pleaded with them to accept the deal to help them win public support for the agreement back home. He wrote Emerson a letter in March 1941, intended for publication in Newfoundland. I would only ask the people of Newfoundland, on whose loyalty we have, in this testing times as throughout her long and eventful history, had ample proof to bear in mind the wide issue which hung upon this agreement. It is with these considerations in our minds that, recognizing to the full the considerable sacrifices made by Newfoundland to the cause which we all have at heart, and her splendid contribution to the war effort. We ask her to accept the agreement. It will be yet one more example of what she is ready to do for the sake of the empire, of liberty, and of the welfare of all mankind. The commissioners had no choice but to bow to Churchill's eloquent appeal and accept the agreement. They would do no more, but as Peter Neary recorded in his monumental work on the Commission of Government years, Emerson and Penson were to leave the British capital fearful and bitterly disappointed men. The agreement, in fact, set a bad precedent for Newfoundland in terms of the British government's right to make a long-term disposition of Newfoundland's territory while holding only temporary authority on the island as a government without appropriate local representation. Churchill's patriotic and moving letter, which was actually written by Sir Charles Dixon, the Assistant Under-Secretary of State, imploring Newfoundland to accept the U.S. bases, was printed in the local newspaper, and the deal went through. The historic meeting between Franklin D. Roosevelt and Churchill 5 months later at Placentia Bay, off the south coast of Newfoundland, underscored the island's strategic significance to both allies. There, the leaders signed the Atlantic Charter, proclaiming the rights of all peoples to self-determination. The irony of those two great champions of democracy plotting to save the free world as they met in the recently recolonized Newfoundland was lost for the moment under weightier concerns. It was fortuitous also that Newfoundland, which had been stripped of its democracy for failure to pay the First World War debt to Britain and Canada, was now able to facilitate the arming of Great Britain and the defense of Canada and the United States at such little cost to each empire, and with only such residual benefits to the people of Newfoundland as could not be conveniently avoided. In 1939, despite the rectitude of the Commission of Government, Newfoundland was even worse off than it had been in 1933. After 5 years of the benevolent dictatorship, 50,000 men were still on relief, and poverty had only increased. These and other criticisms appeared in a series of articles written in London's Daily Express by Mortley Richards, who charged that the UK government had exploited the island and done nothing to improve conditions. Alexander Clutterbuck was assigned the task of rebuting Richards. In an April letter in defense of the Commission of Government, he completely reversed himself on the drastic conclusion he had earlier drawn about Newfoundland in the Amurary Report, and in particular about the justification for suspending Newfoundland's legislature in 1933. Now he argued that disappointing conditions that prevailed in Newfoundland despite the performance of the Commission of Government were due to a depressed world market which no Newfoundland government could control. Not even the government of the much relieved Sir Richard Squires. The justification and pretext for the dismantling of the Newfoundland legislature might be knocked down, but no thought was given to restoring it, nor was there any apology. The Commission of Government would remain at the helm in Newfoundland. What Clutterbuck wrote was for English eyes only. The same year, Thomas Lodge, one of the first British commissioners, published a book, Dictatorship in Newfoundland. About his experience in the Commission of Government, Lodge wrote, "No one inside the British administration had a positive, sincere desire to make a real success of this bizarre experiment in dictatorship. Disillusioned by the failure of the Commission, he concluded, to have abandoned the principles of democracy without accomplishing economic rehabilitation is surely an unforgivable sin. The Dominion's office, although stung by the criticism, did little beyond public relations to improve the situation on the island. The arrival of the American troop ships, the USS Edmund B. Alexander in St. John's Harbor in January 1941 signaled the end of the long depression in Newfoundland and the beginning of prosperity. By 1944, after just 3 years of American activity on the island, not only was there full employment, but the Commission of Government was running surpluses. An astonishing turnaround. The Canadian banks in Newfoundland were also making millions from the large volume of American dollars now coming through their accounts, adding significantly to Canada's foreign currency reserve. Public criticism of the leased bases agreement receded with the enormous financial benefits resulting from the aircraft base building boom. Godfrey Shakespeare, on a whirlwind fact-finding mission for the Dominion's office in 1941, reported on the need to capitalize on the quickly changing state of affairs. I suggest we really make a bold and comprehensive effort to repair the deficiencies of years of unimaginative government. I may add that Americans and Canadians who are pouring millions of pounds into the island for war purposes are shocked at the general state of its development. The housing conditions in St. John's are a disgrace." The level of development on the island was not commensurate with its strategic importance. Shakespeare argued that in view of the American and Canadian investment, Britain's could be no less. As Lord Emerley had before him, and others would later on, Shakespeare outlined a bold plan for reconstruction to justify the continuance of the Commission of Government. He presumed, albeit wrongly, that Canada and the United States would lose interest in Newfoundland after the war, and proposed that it once again be granted Dominion status, making it a British bulwark in the North Atlantic. He saw federation with Canada as a possibility in the future. The policy he proposed would remain essentially unchanged in Britain until 1945. In the meantime, the Americans got the bases they wanted in Newfoundland for the defense of North America. The British got their ships and planes from the Americans, and the Newfoundlanders got the Americans and immediate relief from British thrift. Britain did, however, succeed in having the Americans reduce the salaries they were paying the Newfoundlanders to something more in line with British pay. The Americans were big spenders, but the Americans' invasion, in quotations, was more than a great economic success in Newfoundland. It was a huge social success too. By the time Pepperell Air Force Base closed in 1960, approximately 20,000 American service personnel stationed there had married Newfoundland women, producing 60,000 American Newfoundland children and few recorded divorces. Ironically, the arrival in Newfoundland of thousands of American and Canadian personnel to fight the war in Europe would finally turn Newfoundland's focus away from Europe and towards North America. However, if the American-Newfoundland connection was a marriage of the heart, the same could be said of the Canadian-Newfoundland relationship. As Governor Wayland wrote to Sir Eric Machen, Undersecretary of State at the Dominion's office in 1944, the behavior of the Americans expect in isolated incidents in the early days has been indefinitely better than the Canadian, and so it is, and it's so today. For the defense of Canada, the Canadians were necessarily involved in the defense of Newfoundland. They were there before the Americans and had a base at the harbor of St. John's, as well as air bases in Torbay and at Gander with the Royal Air Force. The sweeping concessions granted to the Americans by the British in Newfoundland by the Lend-Lease Agreement of March 1941 generated both alarm and envy in Ottawa. It is fair to say that the Canadians finally discovered Newfoundland after the Americans' arrival. Early in the war, the Commission of Government had wanted to hand over the management of Newfoundland airports for military purpose entirely to the Canadians, but the plan was rejected out of the hand by J.W. Herbertson at the Air Ministry in Whitehall. In his first telegram to Sir Charles Dixon at the Dominion office on September 23, 1939, released in 1998, Herbertson wrote, "Secret. I have always assumed that our policy was to do nothing with which would tend to give Canada a greater footing in Newfoundland. To hand over the airports to the Canadian Military Air Force would mean the disappearance of our interests there for perhaps a considerable period, at the end of which we might find it difficult to re-establish ourselves. The advantage of the present arrangement, under which we control the airport, is that it gives us a stranglehold over the North Atlantic route and enable us to restrain our partners, Erie and Canada. It would be a grave tactical error to do anything to weaken our position in this matter." Several weeks later, Herbertson followed up with an equally apathetic statement on Newfoundland. It is clear that considerable discussion had taken place in the interval, resulting in a statement of Britain's overarching ambitions in Newfoundland since at least 1933. Herbertson began his second memo of October 13, 1939, with the more formal "We which seemed to speak for the department. We have always understood that it was the decided policy of HMG in the UK that Newfoundland, the oldest British colony, should remain a separate entity and should not be absorbed by Canada. The policy had certainly governed our actions in regards to the provisions of aerodromes and marine air bases facilities in Newfoundland. Since I first went there for preliminary talks in 1933, at that time, which was shortly before the establishment of the Commission of Government, the local government was about to conclude agreements with Pan American Airways, under which the latter would obtain certain exclusive rights for aviation services in the island. I was just in time to stop it. We have spent large sums of money on the provisions for an airport at Hetty's Camps, which is in Gander, and also on the Marine Air Base at Botwood, and on auxiliary services. I think that it would be a great mistake to hand over the airports to the Royal Canadian Air Force for the duration of the war. It is one thing to let them in, but it would be quite another thing to get them out. Newfoundland is destined to play an important part in the operation of the transatlantic service, and it is an important bargaining counter which it would be folly to allow to pass out of our control. Air supremacy was the fundamental consideration underlying all British policy in Newfoundland from at least the 1920s to the late 1940s. It was the key reason for taking full control in 1933, one fully reinforced by the experience of the Second World War. The value British placed on Newfoundland's strategic importance is revealed in the Harbison's casual reference to another British policy, that if using Newfoundland as a bargaining counter in the North Atlantic geopolitical game, the imperious rejection of the commissions and the Canada's request proved entirely impractical. However, the wartime circumstances soon forced the British not only to accept Canada's authority on the basis already on the island, but eventually to grant Canadian the prize they most wanted: a 99-year lease for a Canadian air base at Goose Bay in Labrador. The deal that was bitterly opposed in Canada. Overall, the Canadian presence was felt far less in terms of money, men, and popularity than the American, but it was still a significant investment that Prime Minister Mackenzie King was anxious to profit from and protect. On August 28, 1940, he instructed O.D. Skelton at the Department of External Affairs to prepare a report as to what the British had done in Newfoundland and what we, Canada, had done, and then consider the advisability of acquiring ownership of areas in Newfoundland in which we were spending money. An effort would be made after the war to have us take over Newfoundland. King's assertiveness may have come from more than his $5 million investment in the island. His confidence may have been buoyed by his secret understanding with President Roosevelt on Newfoundland's position after the war. After a meeting with the U.S. President in December 1942, King wrote in his diary that he reminded himself King wrote in his diary that he reminded him of a previous conversation. You said to me some time ago that Canada ought to possess Newfoundland. He remembered that Roosevelt thought the island would be suitable for raising sheep. In response to King's request, Hugh Kindleyside prepared a lengthy memo for Norman Robertson, the acting Undersecretary of State for External Affairs, on the new Canadian position in Newfoundland. Since the outbreak of war in September 1939, Newfoundland has been playing an increasingly large part in consideration relating to Canadian defense. It is quite clear that rather than decreasing in importance as hoped, our relation with Newfoundland during the remainder of this year until the end of the war will be more important than they have been in the past. With Canada taking a very large measure of responsibility for the defense of Newfoundland with Canadian military, naval and air force base established in and possibly operating from Newfoundland, bases with the expenditure of some $5 million by Canadian representatives in the island immediately in prospect, with United States forces established in Newfoundland bases, and with the United States government maintaining a consular representative Consul General in St. John's, it is most desirable that consideration be given to appointing an official representative of the Canadian government to be stationed permanently, or at least until the end of the war. Although Newfoundland is not a dominion, it would perhaps please the people of the island if the Canadian representative in Newfoundland were to be designated a High Commissioner. Unable to continue to ignore Newfoundland as irrelevant to national concern, and with an eye on eventual annexation, Robertson presented the department's recommendations to King in July 1941. It is clear from an inspection of the files of the DEA for the past 6 months that Canada has more varied, more important, and more urgent business with Newfoundland than with all the self-governing dominions in which we maintain high commissioners put together. It may be difficult to get a good man to go to St. John's as High Commissioner, but it is clearly a post which requires an able man who is capable of gaining the confidence and trust of Newfoundlanders. One man who I think could fit in well is C.J. Burchell, now High Commissioner in Australia. He is a maritimer, familiar not only with the question of dominion, provincial relationships, but with Commonwealth constitutional theory and practice, both important qualifications in view of the special problem which Newfoundland relations with Canada presents. He is, however, doing a good job in Australia, and he's not been there very long. He might feel the translation to Newfoundland was not a promotion. King agreed with the need for this posting, but Robertson proved to be correct about Charles Burchell. After arriving in St. John's on a chilly November day in 1941, the new High Commissioner immediately wrote to his boss and offered to return to Australia. King replied, "As much as I appreciate your offer to return to Canberra, I am convinced that you can perform a larger national service by continuing in your present post. The larger service was understood by all concerned as the incorporation of Newfoundland into the Canadian Confederation. And so Burchell stayed on. He moved into a spacious residence, Canada's House, on the corner of Circular Road and Johnny's Hill, and before long there was a steady stream of correspondence and requests for information between the Canadian High Commissioner in Newfoundland and the British Governor. The Canadians had officially arrived. Burchell's appointment was another constitutional anomaly for Newfoundland. Canada maintained a High Commissioner as its senior diplomatic agent in other Commonwealth dominions, but had never had such representation in neighboring Newfoundland. Why Canada should suddenly recognize Newfoundland as worthy of such attention, let alone transfer one of its top diplomats to the post, and at a time when Newfoundland was in a compromised constitutional position with suspended dominion status, was no mystery to the people of Newfoundland. Burchell's appointment was greeted with the same skepticism with which most Canadians moved towards the island were met. The Daily News fumed. How the appointment of the Canadian High Commissioner eliminates Dominion office control over the decisions of Newfoundland government is something inconceivable, unless it be that Mr. Burchell is to stand here in the place of Lord Cranbourne, the Dominion Secretary, and his officials in Downing Street. And if that be the case, then the Canadian High Commissioner would become, in theory, the final arbiter in all decisions involving Canada and Newfoundland. The Fishermen Workers' Tribune went so far as to declare that Newfoundland is to be run by a Canadian commissioner or board. Burchell found this reception disconcerting, and on December 14th he expressed his concerns to Robertson. I find that the attitude of the great majority of people here is that they think Canada is standing by, ready to gobble Newfoundland up and at the proper time. They look with great suspicion on the spending by Canada of money for the defense of Newfoundland, as apparently they fear the Greek bringing gifts. I can recall some instances in which the attitude of Canada has been anything but helpful to Newfoundland, and in respect of which Newfoundlanders have so many grievances. Robertson responded, "It is quite clear that we can never divorce ourselves from an active interest in conditions in Newfoundland, and that in fact we may have to take a very much closer and more immediate part in the fate of our nearest neighbor to the east." Robertson's melancholy reflection that Canada could never divorce itself from Newfoundland seemed an ill omen for a happy union, the inevitability of which he seemed darkly certain. If the American relationship with Newfoundland was a marriage of the heart, as was often said, it seemed certain that any marriage between Canada and Newfoundland would require a shotgun. As the war carried on, both the Canadians and the British in Newfoundland were increasingly embarrassed by the Americans, who were far more popular than the Canadians, and were clearly spending more and doing more for the island than its British ruler had ever done. In June 1942, Paul Emery Evans, Parliamentary Undersecretary for Dominion's office in Great Britain, wrote a memo echoing Godfrey Shakespeare's alarm about the imperial reputation and urging the Dominion's office to speedy action. The Americans and the Canadians are competing with one another in order to impress the Newfoundlanders. Our recent record shows no dramatic or impressive achievement, and this is being noted both in Canada and the US. The remarkable speed and efficiency with which the bases, and especially the base hospitals, have been built has greatly impressed the people, while the development of the Atlantic Air Service is bound to make itself felt. A new and vigorous policy with regards to Newfoundland has become imperative. It is essential that the governor should be appointed for Newfoundland, who will also be the active chairman of the commission. He would in fact combine the duties of the king and the prime minister. Such men cannot be found unless they are taken from important posts, but unless they are spared for work in the empire, its future is dark indeed. At the time, Sir Humphrey Wayland was still governor of Newfoundland, and before he departed in 1946, he would fill out a 10-year term. In spite of Emery Evans' warnings, as soon as Clement Attlee became Prime Minister after the war, he appointed Sir Gordon MacDonald to the position. Sir Gordon was exactly the kind of governor that Emery Evans had envisaged. I can't pronounce that, sorry. But by then, the hour was late, and the future of the British Empire would get no brighter. On June 13, 1942, Sir Eric Machin, responding to Emery Evans' urgent concerns, outlined the situation in Newfoundland for Attlee, who was then the Secretary of State for Dominion Affairs, and he began with this embarrassed nod to democracy. I do agree that the Commission of Government, from its nature, has never been a very happy instrument for the government of a country like Newfoundland. We must actively consider the future after the war. The immense effort made by the Newfoundlanders during the war in the Allied cause and the completely changed financial position, even if only temporary, they are now lending us money instead of our financing them, means that when the war ends, there will be an overwhelming move in favor of the restoration of self-government. This will be difficult to resist, and we ought to be prepared with our line of action. We ought to know our own minds as regards to main issues and not rely on royal commission to make them up for us. Our policy should be to bring Newfoundland into this Canadian Confederation if by any means this can be accomplished. It is clear that the public opinion in Newfoundland has always been intensely against union with Canada, but this is largely due to the fact that the Canadians have regarded them as poor relations. have done in the main little to help them, and have always taken the line that circumstances would force Newfoundland into Canada in due course on Canada's terms. The position, as I see it, is that the change which has taken place in the circumstances of Newfoundland will make it politically impossible to retain control of the UK through a commission of government. There will be a great political pressure for the restoration of free parliamentary institutions in Newfoundland. Machen was obviously reluctant to release Newfoundland from British control and averse to restoring democracy to the island, at least outside the confines of the Canadian Confederation. He was, however, correct in his assessment of local discontent. Opposition to the British Commission of Government had been muted at first. In the darkest hours of 1933, many Newfoundlanders felt that for years they had not been represented by their own government, and that perhaps someone else's government might do better. But by the late 1930s, this tacit acceptance had passed because of the Commissioners General's inaction and lack of communication. The criticism that had been simmering in the local papers had grown to an audible grumble. By the opening days of the Second World War, there were frequent calls from the St. John's Board of Trade and other organizations for a return to some form of representative government, if not full responsible government. Perhaps the most intelligent and informed record of Newfoundlanders' concerns throughout this period can be found in the writing of Albert Perlin, whose Wayfarer column in the Daily News recorded the entire drama. The fact that Canadian High Commissioner Charles Burchell quoted him extensively and frequently in his dispatches to the Department of External Affairs in Ottawa is testimony enough of the soundness and influence of his views. Perlin was the subject of this dispatch, for instance, in June 1942. I have the honor to bring to your attention extracts from recent articles by Wayfarer in the Daily News on the subject of the restoration of responsible government. The Commission government has proved itself an utter and complete failure. It sees itself as a permanent oligarchy. It has done nothing at all to prepare the people for an assumption of the responsibilities of self-government. It seems more concerned with getting a pat on the back from the Dominion office than catering to the natural democratic rights of the people. When you are denied self-government and you have not got good in the form of efficient government to replace it, the urge to political independence becomes that much stronger. It will be noted that Wayfarer suggests some form of representative government should be adopted as a major step towards the restoration of Dominion status after the war, rather than an immediate return to responsible government. He states that no one wants to do anything that would interfere with the war, and that meant acceptance of the war effort. Newfoundland, always intensely patriotic, and had thrown itself wholeheartedly into the war effort. Its support included acceptance of the status quo, the least basis agreement, and even the Goose Bay deal with Canada for the duration of the conflict. But as the war dragged on, it became incumbent on the government in Whitehall to do or say something about the increasingly absurd political situation in Newfoundland. And that's the end of chapter 2. Thank you.